Genesis chapter 6 marks the beginning of the flood narrative, the story of Noah and the ark, as we usually refer to it. If you look at popular imagery and imagination, it's possible to conclude that Noah and his family went on a fun little cruise with some nice animals. But that's not actually even close to reality. We'll look at this story for the next several weeks, so for today, I'd like to simply set forth some context and connect this account to the broader themes that we see in the book of Genesis. There is great discussion and even controversy about the opening verses of this chapter, particularly in regards to who exactly the sons of God are. I'll leave that dilemma for another time, but I will point out that whatever was going on, there was a spiritual and a physical dimension to it. This is confirmed by 2 Peter and the book of Jude in the New Testament. This reality connects this text back to the pattern that we saw in Genesis chapter 3, where Satan manifests himself as a snake or a serpent, and he interacts with Adam and Eve. The outcome here also follows that of chapter 3. It's just multiplied exponentially. Verses 5 and 11 tell us that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil, all the time or continually. And it goes on to say, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. It's as if the sin of Adam and Eve has been given steroids. The second theme that we see here is that of God's unwillingness to allow sin and rebellion to simply continue unabated. And in this, we glimpse God's character. He is sorry or grieved over his creation. A word of caution here, we need to be careful. God is complex, and the descriptions of his emotions are likewise complex. He is certainly saddened over his creation because of their wickedness and their rebellion, but that doesn't mean that he regrets in the sense that he wouldn't do something differently or he would go back and do something differently. It's simply an expression of his holy disdain for sin. God's response here follows the pattern set forth in the Garden of Eden and with Cain. God refuses to stand idly by and allow humanity to descend into this sort of horror of unchecked wickedness. God's judgment in this case matches the problem. He determines to destroy the earth and its inhabitants with a flood. Last chapter, we were introduced to Noah. And now we see the way that God uses Noah. We see how the prophecy about him comes true. Noah, the one who would bring rest, the one who Peter calls a herald of righteousness, the one who is described as being righteous and blameless in his generation, that Noah would be God's agent and partner in not just the judgment of the earth, but also in its recreation and repopulation. In all of this, we are reminded that as long as we live on this earth, that we are in the midst of a spiritual battle. Satan and evil are real, but so is God. And while God allows for the reality of wickedness within the freedom that he gives us, there are limits. And these limits are determined by God. They are enforced by God's power and his sovereignty. And moreover, God uses and empowers people in his redemptive mission. And Noah is just a prime example of this. So for us today, we know that Jesus has overcome sin and death by his death and resurrection. And that as we follow him by faith, that we too are overcomers. So not only do we enjoy this standing, but we are called to actively engage in pushing back against sin and evil. We do this the same way that Noah did. We do this by striving to be blameless in our generation. That is, by living as true representatives of Jesus Christ. And we do this by being obedient to our calling. That's not to say that God will ask any of us to make an enormous boat and fill it with animals, but we are most certainly called to confront evil and to pursue justice in the name of Christ. We're certainly called to share our faith with others, to proclaim the glory of God in word and in deed. In doing so, we will most certainly join with God as he brings about the redemption of the world.